Right, okay. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our final keynote speaker, which is Professor Paul Behrens. So Paul has joined us. He's a British Academy Global Professor, joined us over in Oxford fairly recently from Leiden University, working on integrated models for food transitions, particularly looking at social and environmental outcomes. He's the winner of the he's an international champion at the Frontiers Planet Prize Award from 2023. I think I've mangled that somewhat. But yeah, we got there in the end. And he's also the author of The Best of Times, The Worst of Times, which is a book about climate change challenges with particular kind of focus on both pessimism and optimism. I thought it would be useful to kind of go into Amazon reviews and pick out a particularly bad review and use that as a way. Unfortunately, there's only 50 reviews on there and they're all 5-star. So I couldn't manage that. But anyway, I'll let Paul introduce himself. Paul, it's all over to you.
Thank you so much for the lovely overview there, Pete. And thank you so much for a lovely day. It's been such a wonderful day. This is my first leap, and so it's been really, really wonderful to meet so many people and to see so many wonderful presentations. I'm going to start off with the picture of the food system as it is today, and everybody in the room knows this well, but as one of my main messages today, I think we need to repeat ourselves. We need to make sure that we're repeating things over and over again, because that's what other vested interests do, and that's what we should do as well. And us scientists, we're pretty bad at doing that because we're always looking for novelty, we're always looking for the new thing and explaining the new thing, but we need to say things over and over again. So with this in mind, we've got our planetary boundaries. As many of you know, this is our safe operating space in the green there, and as we move out from that green, we're moving into the red of beyond these safe operating spaces and to possibly catastrophic impacts. And if we look across the planetary boundaries, we see that food systems are the second largest driver of climate change, the biggest driver of biodiversity loss, the biggest driver of land system change, the biggest driver of freshwater change, the biggest driver of nutrient imbalances, the second biggest driver of ocean acidification, the second biggest driver of atmospheric aerosol loading. This is an interesting one. I think in the next few years it will become the largest in many areas of the world. As we move through the energy transition, what will be left over is the ammonia and the PM2.5 we're getting from that, so that will take over in the next few years. And in the novel entities, in terms of the microplastics, is high. Okay. On top of this, we've got a few other sort of non-planetary boundaries here. First, for zoonotic diseases, about 50%. It's very hard to do those sorts of estimates, but pretty high up there. And likely first for antimicrobial resistance. And when we look across all of these things, the majority is driven by agriculture. The majority of agricultural pressures is driven by animal agriculture. When you look across these different domains, somewhere between 60 and 95% driven by animal agriculture. So we need this great food transformation. As many people in the room know, we need a dietary change, we need a reduction in food waste, and we need an improvement in production. But these three pillars are not created equal. And dietary change is by far the biggest option that we have, especially in high-income nations. So far, so good. So far, we've heard this all before. One thing I want to mention today, or one thing I want to sort of posit today, is that we're going plant-based one way or another. Either we will get food system attrition, which will force us to go to more plant-based options. This will be climate impacts on the food system itself, or a resilient transition and get ahead of it and actually do this transition before we do all this damage and be better for it in the first place. So let's have a look at backing this up, and I think this will probably happen sooner than we think. So this is a overview that I put together with a colleague looking at the change in risk over time for different IPCC reports. So these are so-called burning ember plots, and these are sort of these holistic bringing together of the risks of climate change across the different IPCC reports. And what we've got here, we've got 2001 here, all the way up to 2022, and we've got it for different impacts. So we've got the aggregate impacts in terms of the economic and the ecological effects, and we've got the large-scale discontinuities, the so-called tipping elements. And what we see here is that over time, for the same risk, the temperature is coming down and down and down. So what we thought would happen at just above 3 degrees in 2001 for aggregate economic and ecological impacts is now, for that same risk, around that 2-degree mark. And when we look at the large-scale discontinuities, these tipping elements, it's an even steeper drop. So we've got above 5 degrees here, down to below 2 degrees in 2022. Okay, so there's been a systemic underestimation of the climate risks over time. We've been very accurate on the emissions to temperature relationship, except over the last couple of years. That's actually gone off the charts as well. But previously, we've been quite accurate with this emissions temperature relationship, but not so much on these impacts. When we look at the UK specifically, I did some work on the cost of living in the UK and climate change impacts on that. And we see here the difference between the Climate Change Risk Assessment 1 and the Climate Change Risk Assessment 3 for the UK, so several years in between. And what I've got is the risk levels for climate impacts per year. So very high is a climate impact of £1 billion per year by 2050 in that area, so flooding £1 billion per year. And what we can see again is this big increase in the risk associated with the same temperature increase between Risk Assessment 1 in 2012 and Risk Assessment 3 on 2021. And of course, the biggest issue in the UK is flooding, and already we're sort of getting close to that £1 billion a year mark, something like 700 million, 800 million a year. This is quite a remarkable statement from the latest climate change risk assessment. I'll just read it out for us. Better representation of the landscape and urban areas in the kilometre scale model have highlighted that there's a very small chance, less than 0.02%, of exceeding 40 degrees by 2040. And they were very proud of that model because it was a new downscaled model, represented these urban-rural divides really interestingly. Of course, a year later, we broke that 40-degree mark in both rural and in urban areas. Of course, coming back to food, this is going to have big impacts. And this is one of the reasons, I don't know whether people have noticed this in the climate literature, people talking about, well, we're not on the RCP 8.5 pathway anymore, so why are we worried about it? Well, we can get RCP 8.5 impacts at lower emissions. And that's the key issue here. Just last week, we saw the flooding in Australia. This Queensland floods, I mean, Australia is always hard to put in perspective land-wise. There's four UKs, and Queensland is about 42% of Australian cattle production. Australia is 15% of the global cattle market. The 2019 floods lost about 660,000 head of livestock. At the moment, they're estimating 150 so far, but it's going up. Of course, there's millions of head of cattle across that area. So it's a proportion of that, but it's just this grind of climate change, this grind on food systems around the world. Work out of the University of Oxford has looked at the impacts of multi-breadbasket failures, so impacts on at least 10% reductions across multiple regions at once, getting hit by extreme weather events every year. And you know, we've always had them, so the chances before climate change of a breadbasket failure in maize, for example, in corn, would be once every 16 years. At 1.5 degrees, that goes up to once every 3 years, and at 2 degrees, once every 2 years. And maize is the most sensitive crop, but it's similar for the other crops too, in that you see this big jump between the chances before climate change, back in the Holocene, to 1.5 degrees. So this section here, the period that we're moving through in the next 10 to 20 years is really a period of great upheaval in the food system. And this is all some of the reasons why I think we are going plant-based one way or another. Of course, a lot of these crops are used to feed animals. Recent work is then saying, well, okay, can we detect some of these signals in terms of the food shocks? And we can see some of the shocks around the world increasing as we're moving towards the present. So up to about sort of 2015 here, we've seen increasing food shocks in terms of crops and livestock. Not all of this is climate change, so there's shocks of geopolitical shocks in there, but climate change is adding on that extra layer, you know. This is the memo that I mentioned earlier. I actually had a question earlier for Sarah. So this memo I think is worthwhile sort of focusing on, because this is not a scientific assessment. This is coming from food industry executives. And they're talking about wishful thinking and false assurances to investors within the UK food system. And I think this paragraph, just to read this paragraph out, We're releasing this memo because we've reached a moment of threat to food security like none other we have seen. Yield, quality, and predictability of supply from many of our most critical sourcing regions is not something we will be able to rely on upon the coming years. The data on degrading soil health, water scarcity, global heating, and extreme weather events back up what we're seeing from within the system, an interconnected set of crises. So it's in the data, it's in the historic data, it's in the modeling, and it's also now coming from people on the ground working in the system. An estimated third of the UK food price inflation, and talking about communication and getting on message, I think one of the things that we could learn a lot is this message discipline of saying the same things, as I mentioned over and over again. And one of the things that I didn't hear a lot through this whole period is how much climate change is driving this inflationary pressure. So an estimated third of UK food price inflation in 2023 was from climate alone. And then you add on bird flu and other environmental impacts on the food system, could even be greater. The 2022 extreme summer heat event in the European Union alone increased inflation about 0.5 to 0.1 percentage points. And that increases even more as we move to 2035. And some estimates suggest that we'll have persistent climate inflation of between 1% and 3% on food per year by 2035. And so at that rate, we're kind of moving back to the situation where we have the same proportion of disposable expenditure spent on food as way back in the past, running the clock back to like the 1970s, where we're spending sort of 20% on food. And how this rolls out, I think, don't be worried. This is well, do be worried, of course. This is the depressing area of the talk. We will move on to what will change here. So, if we have a look at the cost of living over time, I mean, this is one theory for how things will roll out, and this is just a schematic. You know, we've always had these inflationary pressures over time. We've had oil embargoes. We've had all sorts of things hit us. But what climate change is doing is, putting on an extra layer on top of that. And so it can be very high layer in terms of current policies, or we can adapt to mitigate and have this lower layer. So then we're thinking, what are deflationary pressures that we can have in the food system through this transition? What more resilience can we have through this transition? Because the cost of living and inequality is so incredibly severe, these effects, that they really drive the societal stability. You know, and we saw strikes in the UK during this period because people's incomes weren't enough. We see food riots across many middle-income nations, and the media doesn't do a great job of reporting this. So during COVID, there were food riots around middle-income countries around the world because of those food prices. We didn't really hear about it so much. Eventually, of course, that results in political instability, and we've seen that all over sort of the Middle East and some of the Southeast Asian countries. Ultimately, I don't think we have space for this food system we currently have anymore. And this is because global food production, it will move ever more outside the safe climatic space as we move into the future. So this is under a high emission scenario. So again, this is under this RCP 8.5. So you might say, well, the emissions are not on track for that. But as I said, we've underestimated these impacts. And this is some work that looked at crop agriculture and animal agriculture and what would be likely outside and very likely inside as these climate changes take hold towards the end of the century. So this is 2080 to 2100. But of course, as with a lot of these studies, this is not including soil suitability, pest spread, extreme weather events, water availability from aquifers, pandemics, all the other impacts on the food system. So when you're sort of looking at this from a complex systems perspective, as a lot of the people in the room do, and I've heard sort of a lot today, then you're thinking, well, how does this look for the food system? Well, ultimately, we get to these plateaus, and we find our ways and innovate around them. We have the agricultural revolution. We have artificial fertilizers, just to name two, but there's obviously many more. And we have this across many sort of technical domains. But we've moved the system or the landscape to such a state now where we're running against this treadmill that's pulling us back. And we're degrading that to a point where we're potentially facing a food system collapses. And if you look at some of the survey work that's been done, a lot of food system experts think this is not a negligible possibility. And when you think about collapse, it sounds very scary, but what it really means is a simplification. You need all of these inputs to increase the complexity of whatever system you're looking at, the biosphere, the innovation system, whatever it is, the social system. You need all these inputs to support this. If the foundations of those supports are knocked away, then you start to simplify again. And so my argument today is, what better way to simplify than to eat down the trophic levels? And what better way to actually become more resilient to this future that's coming down the road? Because I think, yeah, one way or another, we're going this way. So if we have a look around the world and we have a look at the crops that are being grown for feed and biofuels and compared to direct consumption, you can see this is kind of the inverse of the map that we saw earlier in terms of the agricultural niche. I should have mentioned before, the agricultural niche, that study estimated that we might lose about 30% of the agricultural land to climate change by the end of the century. And we absolutely need more land to meet government and nature targets, climate and nature targets. This is some work by Baozhao Liu, a student of ours, who they looked at the change in land if we were to move to the Eat Lancet reference diet on the top here. And the blue is in saving land, and the red is in increased land. Now, of course, it'd be really interesting to do this with the future niche as well and see how that actually played out. The amount of land you save there is Canada for the Eat Lancet reference diet, and for the full plant diet. I think this is one of the things that's sort of missed maybe from the Eat Lancet modeling, is that there is actually a range. There's a high range of meat consumption, and then there's a low range of plant, and actually it goes all the way down to 0 in the Eat Lancet diet. So there are ranges there. And in the plant Eat Lancet diet, we're saving an area the size of Canada, India, and Brazil. And this is making up for potentially this 30% loss that we see in some of the previous slides. If the UK on its own ate a plant-rich diet, say the reference diet, we'd save an area almost the size of Scotland, be much healthier for it. This is work from Zhangzhao's son and Baozhao. And we see these different diets then on the x-axis as we move away from the current diet to eat animals, so that's the high animal content in the Lancet diet, across to the eat plants diet. We save a Scotland, and we save a Wales and a bit. If we move further down to, it's always a Wales and a bit. I mean, you could have done all of these as a Wales. Wales is actually a really great area, isn't it? I mean, but unfortunately, we want to use it for lots of different things, but we'll get onto that. Another way of looking at this is in a figure like this. So we can see the total UK agricultural land, about 17 million hectares there, and we can see our current consumption. This is our current diet, and this is a diet alone. And so we can see the animal products in the reds and the plant products in the green. Now, if we were then to move to the reference diet, we'd save quite a lot of land, of course. So we've got the total UK agricultural land here again. And with that land, we can start to do things that the government is promising. So 30 by 30, the biodiversity target, approximately. The 2050 biodiversity target. The bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. Not that I think that that's a particularly good idea to do. I think it's a bad idea to do. But we have that land there. And of course, this is theoretically being self-sufficient in terms of the land that we actually need for the consumption or to supply the diets that we eat. It fits within this scope. So if we were to go further and to go to the Lancet plant diet, now I should mention that the area of these bars is the total calories. So we can see the area of the total calories here. And if I were to do the same thing again, we'd also have enough, almost enough, for sustainable aviation fuels. So the Royal Society thinks that we'd need vast amounts of land if we were to use bioenergy for the sustainable aviation fuels. My feeling is, and probably a lot of the people in the room as well, is that BECCS and sustainable aviation fuels was pretty bad use of land in this way, and that we probably will need more of that land for resilience and potentially for growing and exporting that to populations that are going to need it under these niches that we saw earlier. Because of course, this total agricultural land can actually move down as well in the UK. So our agricultural niche can actually reduce as well. Of course, on top of this, if these changes, we have massive climate resilience. So just a couple of studies here. Afforestation reduces the number and intensity of cyclones everywhere over Europe compared to experiments with smaller forest cover. So you can really reduce the storm surges that you get by quite significant amounts. Similarly, this is one study on rewilding projects and then the hydrological effects of them, and it was sort of a meta-analysis of a lot of different studies that are measured, modeled, and the blue ones there is where they could find evidence for the attenuation of these flood events due to rewilding. And you can see again that positive message that if we make these changes, not only do we save the land that we need to actually produce the food that we need, we're actually more resilient, and our crops are more resilient to those impacts. I'd also say, this is a tricky one, but if we're talking about simplification, then we're talking about, and collapse, then we're talking also about simplifying the land, but we're also talking about simplifying economies and simplifying the rural economy. And this is a work from Anik, which many of you might have seen earlier. The amount of subsidy that we would need to support such a smaller system goes down quite dramatically in a similar way to the land. Of course, we're moving to elms, but under the sort of the continuation of the CAP scheme for several years there, after we sort of left the EU, this is what the picture would look like. If we looked at the embodied labour input, that goes down, so that's a smaller system there as well. If we look at the income, excluding the subsidies, actually in the UK, and this is not true for all of Europe, but in the UK, you'd see very marginal impacts on the overall profitability of the agricultural system. So you're actually simplifying things and you're not really changing the income so much. There are huge issues with a just transition here, of course, because you're talking about big labour changes and big subsidy changes, and maybe, obviously what we're trying to do now is move towards subsidising public goods rather than agriculture. But the point is that by simplifying the system, you give yourself headroom to roll with the shocks of climate change, to roll with the crop impacts. So ultimately, it might mean that we get deflationary food pressures. So we might be able to deal with some of this ongoing inflation in food costs around the world. This is highly contingent and subjective, but I think we might actually see deflationary food pressures from this. Additionally, you might see simplified asset investments, because if you're spending more and more money on defending against climate change, these are costs we didn't have to spend before, which reduces those resources to be able to deal with more climate change, of course, and make productive investments in society. And so actually the capital intensity of the system is actually really important as well, so how much you actually have to build and invest in. This is the asset intensity, so this is the amount of euros you need in buildings, in machinery, to produce a kilogram of product. And you can see here that we've got the red again and the green, and in the yellow we've got the feed. So one of the underappreciated aspects of this is that we don't only have to think about just transitions for livestock farmers, but we do actually also have to think about just transitions for the arable farmers providing the feed for the livestock industry. And we often sort of forget that part of things. It might be the case that climate change hits so hard and we have these yield losses so great that actually we need to keep it all in production. But then even still, it would be preferable to have that feed going directly to humans rather than to animals first. Now, if we to then look at the different dietary changes based on this, again, we see this lower asset intensity. So we see this lower requirement for buildings, for machinery, for equipment. And again, that's giving you more headroom. That's giving you more space to cope with these impacts. So it's a simplified system, which goes nicely with this these problems that we're seeing. And food producers are about 35% leveraged. So in terms of their debt to equity ratio, they're highly leveraged compared to the rest of the system. So they really need help in this transition. It's something we're really going to have to focus on. And we've heard already today some presentations from Stephanie about the stranded assets in the system. Fortunately, I should mention, the depreciation rates in the agricultural system is much faster than fossil fuels. So whilst fossil fuel infrastructure can last like 40, 50 years, in agriculture they typically depreciate around 7 to 9% a year. And so that's a relatively quick depreciation rate, but we will need to coordinate that well if we're going to do this. So I think this is very sort of Very analogous to the energy transition and what the energy transition is going through. This is a somewhat overwhelming picture, Sankey diagram, of the primary energy going into the system and the useful energy that we get out. And we've got our renewables and nuclear up here. We've got our gas and our fossil fuels down here. And we can see these very large losses. This is the UK system in 2025. If we move now to 2050, we see an electrified system. Every time you electrify something, you improve the efficiency 3-4 times. So for electric vehicles, you're going from like 16% efficiency in petrol vehicles to 80% odd efficiency in electric vehicles. Same thing with heat pumps, same things with a lot of industrial energy systems. And so what you're actually doing is you're going from a system where you've got primary energy way up here, doesn't really matter about the units, to a third less in 2050, and for greater useful energy out. And again, I think this is quite promising in the sense of simplicity. It's not simplifying in the sense that everybody owns everything and it's all coming from one place. You can diversify the energy generation so that it's resilient to these impacts too. So you've got energy generators everywhere and adaptive grids and things. But it's simplified in the sense that the amount of throughput that we need in terms of the fossil fuels that we're constantly importing and then putting up into the atmosphere, compared to the materials in society we can continue to recycle in the future. It's actually an asset in society, the future energy system. This has big impacts for agriculture also. We don't have time to really sort of talk into about all of that, but I think it's fairly analogous now with an energy transition in terms of this efficiency and resiliency piece in terms of dietary transitions. We've got 65% lower labor inputs, 50% lower land inputs, 70% lower subsidy inputs, 75% lower asset intensities. And this is for the reference diet, not for the plant-based diet. And so again, there's this sort of idea of efficiency here when we're dealing with a system that's actually struggling under the burden of environmental damage. And so we can there's many ways in which we can sort of use this headroom, if you like. So we can absorb some of the climate yield losses. We can help farmers transition to more direct food for people, and then absorb some of these losses. When we saw the second worst harvest last year, we will continue to see more damage, of course. We could have some of the systems that people talk about, these very limited mixed systems in the future. We could have inter or multi-cropping, which takes more labor, it takes more input, it takes more effort often. We could have greater food diversity and risk-taking. And we could use perennials, which typically have lower yields, but we've saved the land and we're able to do that. And of course, you've got these options for public and resilience of the system. So if we look at tourism, if we look at recreation, if we look at opportunity for green space access, I mean, in the UK, we have one of the worst mental health outcomes in the OECD, and we know that green space is good for mental health and physical health. And people often don't have that space to enjoy green space. This last point, I think, when you think about the UK specifically, there's very few areas of true wilderness in the country. When you think about even areas like in Poland, I mean, or even further afield if you go to the US, for example, this idea of wilderness, this idea of nature, being able to use the energy and the inputs there to be thriving. There is also, I mean, there's so many more things to say. I mean, even if you were to reduce the meat consumption and move to plant-based consumption, you would also reduce the air pollutants that I mentioned earlier. And that's apparently suppressing yields around sort of 5 to 10%. So if we're made to make those transitions as well, we get higher yields even while we get hit by climate change. So, I think, it's a really positive story of the change. And I know a lot of people in the room already sort of are fully aware of this positive story. So why aren't we getting there? Why is this so difficult? And we've heard some of this today. It's so nice actually talking at the end of the day because everybody's seen so much and it's all like chiming with different things. So it's really nice and really fascinating presentations. So it's the same story again. We've got smoking, we've got global warming, we've got oil, and it's the same story with meat and dairy. There's nuances to it. There's some differences I'll talk about, but it's the similar playbook. And if you haven't seen this report already, it's well worth reading from the Changing Markets Foundation. It's an extremely long report. I read it. It was one of those ones you start reading it and you think, oh, I'm never going to get through all of this. I've got stuff to do. And then it gets dark and you're still reading it and you're still reading it and your eyes are opening and your eyes are opening even wider. And it's not because you haven't put the light on yet. And it's really an excellent piece. Now, you can also just read the executive summary. It's, that is actually also something you can do. But if you do that, go to later on in the documents, in the reports, and what they do is they show all the different ways that lobby groups have influenced specific EU policies and how they did it and what the result was for the Green New Deal. And it was really interesting. So a similar sort of thing: discredit the science, disseminate false information, spread confusion, promote doubt. There's the same arguments and tactics: economic fear-mongering, scientific interference, false and limited solutions, greenwashing, denial, distract, delay. In addition, with this one, we've also got an industry convergence when it comes to biogas. So we've got actually the oil industry and the agricultural industry somewhat working together in some of these areas. And of course, the same old story again when we see sort of the public money going into supporting campaigns for meat. And one of the things that was highlighted from the new motions of doubt is how precisely the industry is often focusing on young people, because they know that that's where the dietary habits are formed. And so if you can address that and address that hard, it's harder to overcome in the future. Edelman, which is one of the public relations companies that worked for big oil and big tobacco, they're now advising meat and dairy, and they run campaigns with some of the biggest YouTubers in the world to run things like promoting eggs, promoting chicken, promoting beef. And so this is why I say this message discipline is important, and this repeating is important, because that's what people are seeing over and over again in their feeds. And of course, you've got to have a lot of thought for struggling farmers and the people with lower incomes who are getting caught in the crossfire of this system that's not providing, of course. And they're being able to, be motivated and motivate people's sense of injustice and inequality in sort of resisting some of these changes. So in terms of pushing back, we've been involved in a few different efforts to push back on misinformation. I'm just going to put a few things up here. If you haven't read this article by Jochen's team, it's very, very interesting about the Dublin Declaration in particular. Have a look at that. And the response was so extra. So basically the Dublin Declaration then wrote back to them saying there's all these issues, and then the team went and did a massive survey and showed that there were the things that they highlighted were the issue. And it's really quite a remarkable piece of work that actually adds to the literature as well. It's one of those examples where, a response a situation in a journal actually adds to the scientific literature. Normally it's just correcting things, but this one they actually went way beyond. I think the last couple of things I want to say here is, I wonder whether we also have a pluralistic ignorance of ourselves. We've heard a lot about today in terms of the pluralistic ignorance of how much people want this change and how much people actually are interested in it. Not to say that everybody wants it, but it's often higher than we think. And if you look at the studies of this across the world in terms of climate policies, it's true that we tend to underestimate how much other people want change by about half. So one study in the US, for example, looked at the support for a carbon tax, and they asked people, do you think people are supportive of a carbon tax? What percentage of the country do you think is supportive? About 32% people said. And they said, do you support a carbon tax? And it was actually about 64%. And we do this across the board. And I wonder whether we do this to ourselves as well. This was a study by a colleague of mine who asked 9,000 scientists, climate scientists across Europe, about climate change advocacy. So first of all, he asked, if you do this advocacy, does this damage your scientific reputation? And 85% of people said no. So there's not a concern. There's not as much as concern. And I think this is really interesting. If we go across from not willing to already do, engaging in climate change advocacy, 13% are not willing to, 58% are willing to, and 30% already do. But if you look at the willing to, there's a huge group of people there who would like to do stuff, but are not able to currently do stuff, either because they don't have the access, because of incentives in academia, the ability to get involved. And so I think there's a huge opportunity there for us to be correcting the scientific misinformation out there, for us to be getting involved in talking about the changes that we need to see. So just to wrap up here, I think we're at this unique moment in history. It's quite scary what's happening around the world, but it's also incredibly, incredibly optimistic if we can make some of the changes that we want to see. Now, I think, personally, these changes are going to happen one way or another. We're either going to be forced to do them or we're going to do them ahead of time. But if we are able to do them ahead of time, it will really change the way our landscapes look. It will change the way we eat, our health, everything around us, the way we can deal with climate and environmental harms. So I think the first thing is to be honest. I think sometimes we sort of self-censor, because it's quite scary stuff, but I think we need to be honest. I think we need to be alarmed and be alarmed when we're talking about these things, because we're humans too. But then I think we need to give solutions. It's not enough just to leave people with this sense of amorphous doom. I mean, what does that amorphous doom look like? Hopefully we've got some picture of what that doom looks like, but we also know what we need to do about it and act based on those solutions, both ourselves and also encourage other people to act. And it's the action that gives the hope. I personally am never really hopeful when I hear just sort of words or, just general niceties. It's the action that builds the hope. And as I said, repeat over and over again. The first time that you're completely sick of saying something is the first time somebody else is hearing it. So, and I've said that before and I'm really sick of saying it. So I think the IPCC has it right. Every action matters, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, every choice matters. And this is still my favorite cartoon. A lot of people have probably seen this by now. It's all the wonderful things that we could have, even if, climate change wasn't a thing, and unfortunately it is. And talk about these opportunities and this diversity. And we talked about, if there's more options on the table, you're more likely to take them up. And we're seeing that again and again and again across studies, and that's really incredibly optimistic. And so if we can rely and lean on these diversity, this enjoyment of food, this enjoyment of the diversity of plant-based foods, then that's great. But also connecting that to the broader picture of what that means for us and our environment. I rattled through quite a lot today. There is a book if you want to read a little bit more, go into energy and demographics as well. But I will leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks very much.